The ruble is on the brink of collapse, and the yuan is in danger. On June 12th, the US government hit Russia with heavy sanctions, directly targeting Russia's foreign exchange settlement center and cutting off their last way to exchange rubles for US dollars. This left Russian President Vladimir Putin scrambling, forcing him to urgently halt all foreign exchange transactions. If trading platforms dare to continue operating, the ruble-to-US dollar exchange rate would plummet from 1 to 100 to much worse within days. Even with these countermeasures, in just one day, the ruble-to-US dollar exchange rate still dropped dramatically to 200 to 1. Panic spread rapidly throughout Russia. In St. Petersburg, crowds are gathering at currency exchange points, and people are rushing to banks to withdraw their money. The Russian government quickly rolled out several measures to stop bank runs. Big banks like Rosbank and Gazprom Bank are still blocking customers from logging in and have shut down all services to prevent a destructive chain reaction caused by the bank run. However, this crisis extends far beyond Russia. On June 14, the Central Bank of the Russian Federation announced that rubles could no longer be directly exchanged for US dollars. It could only be exchanged for yuan. Thousands of Russians rushed to banks to exchange their rubles for yuan, then tried to convert the yuan to dollars on the black market. This flood of yuan into the market started to put pressure on the yuan to US dollar exchange rate. If this continues, the People's Bank of China will be forced to buy back yuan with US dollars, draining China's reserves used to keep the exchange rate stable. Analysts pointed out that while the US sanctions seemed aimed at the ruble, they were actually draining China's dollar reserves. During Putin's visit to Beijing in May, the two central banks had already agreed on a fixed exchange rate between the ruble and the yuan for 3 months. If Russians keep holding yuan, the ruble's devaluation will inevitably drag down the yuan. If China's dollar reserves run out and the US sanctions the yuan will face the risk of collapse. Even though China's foreign exchange reserves are not enough, Xi Jinping wants to take on the West in a financial war and has already taken alternative measures. Insiders say Xi's office has even set up a secret group of financial experts to figure out how to collapse the US dollar with a detailed 15-point action plan. This includes tightening foreign exchange controls, selling off US debt, encouraging Chinese companies to return to China, and seizing US assets in China. First, China plans to bring back mandatory currency settlement, meaning if you have a US dollar account in a Chinese bank, those dollars could be forcibly converted into yuan at any time. This is aimed at bringing private US dollar income into state control. Second, China will impose departure taxes and capital gains taxes on people with overseas investments, forcing them to bring their money back to China. Penalties for avoiding tax will be harsh, potentially even exceeding the original investment. More severely, China will raise financial risks to a political level, labeling those who dare to invest abroad as committing financial crimes with severe punishments. Underground money changers and other gray market operators will be eliminated. Domestically, China will do everything possible to gather US dollars. Internationally, China plans to sell US debt on a large scale, potentially worth hundreds of billions of dollars. Additionally, China will force Chinese companies listed in the US to return, taking the money they raised in US stock markets. Debt-laden real estate companies are ordered to repay domestic debts first, with foreign investors left to wait. It's said that Xi Jinping's think tank is planning a big move to confiscate US assets in China. The assets of the US government, investments by American companies, and even the property of American citizens in China are all seen as easy targets by the Chinese Communist Party. Of course, the CCP knows this move is quite shocking, so they've been hesitant to act. But sources say that if the US takes action against China over its stance on the Russia-Ukraine issue, the CCP might just play this trump card. In trade, the CCP is blatantly pressuring allies to settle in yuan, whether it's imports or exports. And for foreign companies investing in China, there is no chance of settling in dollars. If this continues, foreign companies will be completely thrown off. The value of the yuan could change any day, and converting yuan to dollars will depend on the whims of the CCP. For amounts over 50,000 US dollars, you'll have to queue up and get approved. If it gets rejected, your money is stuck in China. Foreign companies are used to settling in US dollars. With the CCP's new policies, multinational companies might just move their operations to Singapore. More strangely, China is forcing foreign companies to settle in yuan for Chinese exports. Later, when they want to convert these offshore yuan to dollars, the CCP might not even allow it. So foreign importers are wondering if it's worth doing business with a CCP under these conditions. This kind of business might only happen a few times before companies decide it's too risky, even if Chinese goods are cheap. The CCP also wants to absorb the dollar-dominated debts of Belt and Road countries. The key is that these debts, while bad, are linked to many American financial institutions and investors. If the CCP combines these scattered debts, they would hold a trump card against the US. Imagine if the CCP suddenly tells the US that they'll only repay 10% of those debts. Take that or leave it. Then what would happen? First, the American banks and investment institutions holding these debts would suffer huge losses. Their balance sheets would worsen and their stock prices would plummet, possibly triggering market panic and a sell-off by investors. Worse, this shock wouldn't be confined to just a few institutions. The highly interconnected, modern financial system means one institution's collapse could affect others. Interbank loans and cross-investment by investors could become channels for risk transmission. If not handled properly, it could even lead to a systemic financial crisis. Facing this debt bomb from the CCP, the US government would have to respond cautiously. They could either bail out the failing financial institutions or let the market tremble while worrying about the crisis spreading. Either way, the US would be in a tough spot, which is exactly what the CCP wants. They could use this situation to force the US to make concessions on other issues, earning foreign exchange and hitting the dollar market. The CCP's actions are extremely sinister. Biden likely won't sleep well until the regimes in China and Russia are brought to an end. The sanctions on Russia's international settlements are actually paving the way to end both the Chinese and Russian regimes. Next, similar sanctions might be imposed on China, cutting off SWIFT access and possibly blocking access to the Bank of International Settlements. Amidst this, the Chinese National Defense Ministry spokesperson is boasting about defeating any foreign forces without mercy. The US government has repeatedly warned the CCP. The US Embassy in Beijing released a speech by National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan. He stated they have expressed their concerns to China about providing dual-use equipment to Russia, which is being used to kill Ukrainian civilians. The US has taken actions to prove they are serious. President Biden, Secretary of State Antony Blinken, and Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen have all voiced the same concerns to China. In diplomatic terms, the term concerns often means severe warnings. On June 13th, President Biden, during a joint press conference with Ukrainian President Zelensky, bluntly stated that the equipment provided by China is helping Russia kill Ukrainians. This indicates that the US has moved past warnings and might soon implement sanctions. Historically, the US repeatedly warned Japan to surrender before dropping the atomic bombs, implying similar consequences if China doesn't heed the warnings. This currency war is essentially the ultimate showdown between the US-led free market economy and the CCP-led state capitalism. It is a fierce contest between dollar domination and the ambition for the yuan to rise. If the US imposes financial sanctions and China's dollar reserves are insufficient, the yuan's exchange rate could collapse, potentially devaluing several times over in a very short period until the currency becomes worthless. If this happens, Chinese people's savings would vanish, the economic order would completely break down, social unrest would intensify, and the current regime would face the risk of being overthrown. China's strategy, on the other hand, involves creating global chaos through the Belt and Road Initiative, digital currency, cyber hacking, and overseas infiltration. They aim to disrupt global supply chains and dismantle the dollar-based international monetary system, ultimately causing the collapse of the dollar system. Objectively, the US has the upper hand in this confrontation. As some commentators have noted, the CCP supplies the US market with a large number of cheap goods. Without the US, its biggest export market, many export-oriented Chinese companies would face bankruptcy, leading to massive job losses and severe impacts on economic growth and social stability. Does the CCP have the resolve to go all the way in a confrontation with the US? Probably not. But the US is far less dependent on China. If Chinese companies suddenly stop exporting to the US, will Americans face a crisis of having no clothes to wear, no food to eat, and no cars to drive? Will people take to the streets demanding the government to beg the CCP? The answer is clearly no. While Chinese goods hold a certain market share in the US, they are mostly replaceable. Even without these products, the quality of life in the US wouldn't suffer significantly. Moreover, global supply chains are not exclusive to China. The US can easily source from other countries. With America's strong technological innovation, high value-added industrial structure, an extensive global business network, it can maintain economic prosperity without China. As US officials have said, without China, the US can still thrive. On the other hand, the CCP stands isolated on the global stage, surrounded by opposition. It is clear who holds the upper hand. Every time the US signals a possible decoupling or full-scale sanctions against China, the CCP can only vocally oppose without many effective countermeasures. They know that a complete fallout with the US could lead to economic collapse and regime downfall, repeating the Soviet Union's fate. In this ultimate showdown, the scales of victory have already tipped. Nonetheless, we shouldn't underestimate the CCP's tactics in its struggle against the US. To counter dollar dominance, the CCP is making multiple efforts to build a financial network independent of the dollar system. For instance, Xi Jinping has called for expanding currency swaps with BRICS and Belt and Road countries. Putin has confirmed that BRICS is developing an independent payment system. Simultaneously, the CCP is encouraging major enterprises like Saudi Aramco to list on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange, gradually eroding the US capital market. In the military domain, the CCP is boldly demonstrating against the US. Xi Jinping has not only increased military spending to 5% of GDP, but also issued special bonds specifically for military construction. More worryingly, the CCP is covertly using cyber tools to attack the US. The FBI recently disclosed the 9/11 S5 botnet controlled by Chinese agent Wang Yunhe, which uses malware to control over 19 million computers worldwide, including more than 500,000 in the US. The CCP can use these affected computers to attack the US financial system, causing chaos by simultaneously selling or buying stocks and futures, thereby undermining the US from within. Besides cyber attacks, the CCP is also using overseas Chinese for financial fraud. Recently, 22 Chinese nationals were arrested in Zambia for committing cybercrimes through spreading false information and identity theft. These cases show that the CCP is using financial warfare, cyber warfare, and psychological warfare as strategic weapons against the US, aiming to weaken the opponent without a declared war. Faced with the CCP's various schemes, the US must stay vigilant and prepared. The urgent tasks are to dismantle the CCP-controlled botnets, cut off its infiltration into American society, and enhance the financial market's resilience. Fundamentally, only by overthrowing the CCP regime and eliminating this source can the US and the free world be completely safe. U.S. Deputy Secretary of State Kurt Campbell's recent statements indicate that the U.S. has made a strategic decision on this issue. Known as the Asia Czar and a key figure in U.S.-China policy, Campbell openly mentioned overthrowing the Beijing regime on June 12th. Although he emphasized that at this moment, overthrowing the CCP is not in America's interest, the implication is clear. As the timing matures, U.S. actions to overthrow the CCP regime will be unstoppable. Campbell's statement is reminiscent of the U.S. strategy on military aid to Ukraine, initially denying support, then gradually shifting stance. This incremental approach is a common tactic for U.S. politicians to pave the way for major actions. As Deputy Secretary of State, Campbell is responsible for providing policy options to the top. By publicly proposing the option of overthrowing the CCP, it signifies that there is already a consensus within the US on this issue, and preparations for subsequent actions are underway. In fact, there has long been a consensus within both US parties to overthrow the CCP regime. Current sanctions, pressures, and containment measures against China are all clearing the path for this ultimate goal. In the eyes of Western countries, the CCP regime, as an enemy of humanity, must be eradicated for the world to achieve true peace and security. Despite the challenges, the process of overthrowing the CCP is now irreversible. From this perspective, Campbell's statement is significant. It suggests that the US timetable for overthrowing the CCP has begun and the countdown is ticking. The question is no longer if, it is when and how to overthrow the regime. Regardless of the CCP's attempts to avoid it, they will inevitably face retribution. As the old Chinese saying goes, the net of heaven is vast. Though its meshes are wide, nothing escapes. Meaning, although divine justice may seem lenient and slow, it is ultimately thorough and inescapable. The judgment of history will come sooner or later. In this great struggle for the future of humanity, the flag of victory will undoubtedly belong to the side of justice.